The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that seemed designed to induce headaches and poor decision-making. Agent Sarah Chen had noticed this about government buildings. They all seemed to share the same oppressive lighting system, as if someone had conducted a study and determined that slightly uncomfortable illumination was optimal for bureaucratic efficiency. She adjusted her position in the hard plastic chair, third row from the front, and tried to focus on the instructor's monotonous explanation of threat assessment protocols. The purpose of today's exercise, Agent Morrison droned from the front of the room, is to test your ability to identify potential threats in a controlled environment. You will be presented with a series of scenarios, and your task is to determine which individuals pose the greatest risk to operational security. The room was filled with federal agents from various departments, FBI, CIA, ATF, DEA, all gathered for what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. Sarah had attended dozens of these sessions over her 8-year career, each one blending into the next in a haze of PowerPoint presentations and role-playing scenarios, but something felt different about this particular session, though she couldn't quite articulate what it was. The instructor continued his presentation, clicking through slides that detailed various threat indicators, suspicious behavior patterns, psychological profiles, environmental factors that might influence an individual's propensity for violence. Standard material, really, nothing Sarah hadn't seen before. But as she glanced around the room at her fellow agents, she began to notice something unsettling. Agent Rodriguez, 2 seats to her left, was taking notes with an intensity that seemed excessive for such routine material. His handwriting was small and cramped, and he kept glancing up at specific individuals in the room before returning to his notepad. Agent Thompson, in the row behind her, had positioned himself so that he could observe the maximum number of people while appearing to focus on the presentation. Most concerning was Agent Williams in the front row, whose body language suggested he was coiled and ready for action. Despite the mundane nature of the training, Sarah had always prided herself on her observational skills. It was what had made her successful in her field. But as the presentation continued, she realized she was no longer just observing the training materials. She was analyzing her colleagues with the same scrutiny she would apply to potential suspects. The irony wasn't lost on her that a training exercise designed to teach threat identification was causing her to identify threats among the very people she worked with. "Now," Agent Morrison announced, "we'll begin the practical portion of our training. I want everyone to stand and move around the room. Observe your colleagues. Take note of their behavior, their positioning, their interactions. In 15 minutes, you'll be asked to identify which 3 individuals in this room you would classify as potential threats." The room erupted into motion, but it was unlike any training exercise Sarah had ever experienced. Instead of the casual mingling and polite conversation typical of such activities, there was an underlying tension that made every movement feel calculated and every glance loaded with meaning. People weren't just observing anymore. They were hunting. Agent Martinez approached her with what might have been a friendly smile under normal circumstances, but now seemed predatory. "Interesting exercise, don't you think?" he said, positioning himself slightly too close for comfort. "Makes you wonder what they're really testing." Sarah maintained her composure, but internally she was already cataloging Martinez's behavior. Invasion of personal space, probing questions, attempt to establish psychological dominance. "Just another day at the office," she replied, stepping back slightly to re-establish appropriate distance. But Martinez wasn't deterred. "I've been watching you, Chen. You're good at this. Maybe too good. The way you position yourself, always with a clear view of exits, never with your back exposed for more than a few seconds. It's impressive, but it's also the kind of behavior that makes people nervous." The comment sent a chill down Sarah's spine, not because it was threatening, but because it was accurate. She had indeed been unconsciously positioning herself strategically throughout the exercise, and if Martinez had noticed, others certainly had as well. The realization that she was being observed with the same intensity that she was observing others created a feedback loop of paranoia that she struggled to control. As she moved through the room, Sarah began to notice that conversations had taken on an interrogative quality. Agent Kim was asking Agent Foster about his recent divorce and financial troubles. Agent Reeves was inquiring about Agent Park's medication regimen. Agent Sullivan was probing Agent Davis about his political affiliations and recent travel history. What had started as a simple training exercise was evolving into something that resembled a witch hunt. The most disturbing aspect was how naturally everyone seemed to slip into this role. These were professional law enforcement officers, trained to maintain objectivity and follow proper protocols. Yet within minutes of being asked to identify threats among their peers, they had transformed into suspicious, calculating individuals who viewed everyone around them as potential enemies. Sarah found herself gravitating toward Agent Jackson, someone she had worked with on several previous cases and considered a friend. But even as she approached him, she couldn't shake the analytical mindset that the exercise had triggered. Jackson was standing near the water cooler, a position that allowed him to observe most of the room while appearing casual. His jacket was unbuttoned, providing easy access to his service weapon. His stance suggested readiness for rapid movement in any direction. "This is getting weird, isn't it?" Jackson said as she approached, but his tone was carefully neutral, and his eyes continued to scan the room even as he spoke to her. "Definitely not what I expected when I rolled out of bed this morning," Sarah replied, attempting to inject some levity into the situation. But she noticed that Jackson's response to her approach had been to shift his position slightly, creating a better angle to observe both her and the rest of the room simultaneously. The 15 minutes felt like hours. Every interaction was layered with subtext, every gesture analyzed for hidden meaning. Sarah realized she was no longer thinking like a law enforcement professional conducting a routine training exercise. She was thinking like prey in a room full of predators. The distinction between friend and foe had become blurred, replaced by a constant assessment of who might pose the greatest threat to her safety and operational security. When Agent Morrison called time and asked everyone to return to their seats, the relief was palpable. But it was short-lived, as the next phase of the exercise involved each participant publicly identifying the 3 individuals they considered to be the greatest threats in the room. Agent Rodriguez went first, confidently naming Agent Thompson, Agent Williams, and, to Sarah's surprise, herself. His rationale was methodical and coldly analytical. Thompson's positioning suggested surveillance training beyond standard protocols. Williams displayed signs of hypervigilance consistent with combat stress, and Chen, Sarah, exhibited behavioral patterns indicating advanced situational awareness that could be leveraged for hostile purposes. Sarah felt her face flush with a combination of anger and embarrassment. To be identified as a threat by a colleague was professionally humiliating. But more than that, it forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. Rodriguez wasn't wrong. She had been unconsciously employing tactics and maintaining awareness levels that went beyond what was necessary for a simple training exercise. As more agents presented their assessments, a pattern began to emerge. The individuals being identified as threats weren't the obvious suspects, the ones who seemed unstable or exhibited clear signs of distress. Instead, they were the most competent agents in the room, the ones whose skills and training made them effective at their jobs but also potentially dangerous if those skills were turned against their colleagues. Agent Thompson identified Agent Kim, Agent Foster, and Agent Martinez as threats, citing their psychological manipulation techniques observed during the mingling phase. Agent Williams named Agent Jackson, Agent Reeves, and Agent Davis, focusing on their weapons handling and positioning strategies. The exercise had devolved into a competition to demonstrate who could most effectively analyze and identify the operational capabilities of their peers. When it was Sarah's turn to present her assessment, she faced a dilemma that cut to the heart of everything that was wrong with the exercise. Her analytical training and observational skills had indeed identified 3 individuals whose behavior suggested they posed potential threats. Agent Martinez for his psychological probing and boundary testing, Agent Rodriguez for his systematic intelligence gathering and note-taking, and Agent Morrison himself for his role in creating and maintaining the paranoid atmosphere that had infected the entire room. But as she stood before her colleagues, preparing to voice these assessments, she realized the fundamental flaw in the entire exercise. By forcing law enforcement professionals to view each other as potential threats, the training had successfully created an environment where trust was impossible and paranoia was not only justified but rewarded. The real threat wasn't any individual in the room. It was the exercise itself and what it revealed about how quickly professional relationships could deteriorate when suspicion became the primary operating principle. "I refuse to participate in this portion of the exercise," Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Not because I'm incapable of making the assessments, but because I believe the exercise itself is fundamentally flawed and potentially damaging to the professional relationships we depend on to do our jobs effectively." The room erupted into murmurs of surprise and disagreement. Agent Morrison's face darkened with irritation. "Agent Chen, this is a mandatory training exercise designed to improve operational security. Your refusal to participate will be noted in your training record. Let it be noted, Sarah replied, but I won't contribute to an environment where competent professionals are encouraged to view each other with suspicion based on the very skills that make them effective at their jobs. The confrontation escalated quickly. Agent Martinez accused her of attempting to avoid scrutiny by positioning herself above the exercise. Agent Rodriguez suggested that her refusal was itself a threat indicator, demonstrating unwillingness to submit to legitimate authority. Agent Williams argued that operational security required the ability to assess threats regardless of personal relationships or professional courtesy. But as the argument continued, something interesting happened. Agent Jackson stood up and announced that he too refused to participate in identifying threats among his colleagues. Within minutes, Agents Kim, Foster, and Davis had joined the rebellion. The room divided into two camps: those who believed the exercise was a necessary and legitimate training tool, and those who viewed it as a dangerous erosion of the trust and cooperation essential to effective law enforcement. The division revealed something profound about the nature of strength and weakness in high-stress professional environments. The agents who continued to participate in the threat identification exercise demonstrated a kind of institutional compliance that could be seen as either professional discipline or a failure to think critically about the implications of their actions. Those who refused to participate showed either principled resistance to a flawed system or dangerous insubordination, depending on one's perspective. Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of leading a small rebellion against what many would consider a routine training exercise. But as she looked around at the faces of her colleagues, some angry, some confused, some supportive, she realized that the exercise had already succeeded in its true purpose, which wasn't to teach threat identification but to reveal the psychological and professional fault lines within the group. The aftermath of the exercise was swift and decisive. Agent Morrison terminated the training session and announced that all participants would be required to submit written reports detailing their observations and experiences. Those who had refused to identify threats among their colleagues would undergo individual counseling sessions to address what the training department termed compliance issues and resistance to legitimate authority. But for Sarah, the real learning occurred in the days and weeks following the exercise. The trust and camaraderie that had existed among the participants before the training had been fundamentally altered. Conversations became more guarded, interactions more formal. The knowledge that colleagues had been prepared to identify each other as threats created a lingering atmosphere of suspicion that proved impossible to completely dispel. More significantly, the exercise forced Sarah to confront uncomfortable truths about her own nature and capabilities. Rodriguez had been correct in his assessment. She did possess skills and maintain awareness levels that could be dangerous if misdirected. The recognition that her competence could be viewed as a threat by others led to a period of intense self-reflection about the relationship between professional effectiveness and personal security. Part 2. The Crucible of Self-Examination. The weeks following the failed training exercise marked the beginning of what Sarah would later recognize as the most challenging and transformative period of her career. The mandatory counseling sessions, initially viewed as punitive measures by the training department, became opportunities for deeper self-examination than she had ever undertaken. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the department psychologist assigned to her case, possessed the rare combination of clinical expertise and practical understanding of law enforcement culture that made her uniquely qualified to guide Sarah through the process of understanding what had happened in that training room. Their first session began with what seemed like a simple question, but proved to be anything but. Tell me about the person you were before you walked into that room, and the person you discovered yourself to be during the exercise. Sarah's initial response was defensive, as was to be expected. She framed her refusal to participate as a principled stand against a flawed training methodology, emphasizing her commitment to professional ethics and collaborative relationships. But Dr. Warren's gentle but persistent questioning gradually revealed the deeper psychological dynamics at play. You mentioned that Agent Rodriguez was correct in his assessment of your tactical awareness and positioning. Can you elaborate on what that means to you personally, not just professionally? The question forced Sarah to examine an aspect of herself she had never fully acknowledged: her hypervigilance, her constant tactical positioning, her unconscious threat assessment of every environment she entered. These weren't just professional skills developed through training. They were survival mechanisms that had become so deeply ingrained they operated below the level of conscious awareness. I suppose I've always been like this, even before I joined the Bureau, Sarah admitted during their third session. Growing up in my neighborhood, you learned to watch everything, notice who didn't belong, keep track of exits and potential weapons. It wasn't paranoia, it was adaptation to environment. Dr. Warren nodded thoughtfully. And when you entered law enforcement, these existing skills were reinforced and refined through training. What happened in that exercise was that your colleagues recognized these skills for what they truly were, not just professional capabilities, but fundamental aspects of how you navigate the world. The insight was both illuminating and disturbing. Sarah began to understand that her refusal to identify threats among her colleagues wasn't just about protecting professional relationships. It was about refusing to acknowledge that she herself might be the kind of person others would have legitimate reason to fear. This realization led to a period of intense introspection about the nature of strength and weakness, particularly in high-stress professional environments. Sarah had always prided herself on her competence, her ability to handle dangerous situations, her reputation as someone who could be counted on when things went wrong. But the exercise had revealed that these same qualities could be viewed as threatening by others. The question you need to ask yourself, Dr. Warren suggested during their fourth session, is whether the person you've become in order to excel in this profession is the person you want to continue being. It was a profound question that struck at the heart of Sarah's identity. It was a profound question that struck at the heart of Sarah's identity. She had spent 8 years carefully crafting a professional persona that emphasized strength, competence, and reliability. She was the agent who could be trusted with the most difficult assignments, the one who stayed calm under pressure, the one who always seemed to know what to do. But this persona had been constructed layer by layer, year by year, until it had become difficult to distinguish between her professional identity and her authentic self. The process of examining this constructed identity was painful and disorienting. Sarah found herself questioning not just her professional choices, but fundamental aspects of her personality and worldview. Had her hypervigilance become pathological? Was her tactical awareness a healthy adaptation, or a sign of underlying trauma that she had never addressed? Were the skills that made her effective at her job preventing her from forming genuine personal relationships? These questions became even more complex when she considered the aftermath of the training exercise. The agents who had been identified as threats, herself included, were all highly competent professionals with excellent performance records. They weren't threats in any conventional sense. They were simply individuals whose skills and awareness levels made them formidable in ways that could be unsettling to others. "There's a paradox here," Sarah explained to Dr. Warren during their sixth session. "The better I become at my job, the more threatening I appear to the people I work with. But if I try to dial back those skills, I become less effective and potentially endanger myself and others in dangerous situations." Dr. Warren's response was characteristically thoughtful. "Perhaps the issue isn't whether you should change who you are, but whether you should accept responsibility for how your capabilities affect others and find ways to use them more consciously." This suggestion introduced a new framework for thinking about personal and professional development. Instead of viewing strength and competence as inherently positive qualities, Sarah began to consider them as tools that could be used constructively or destructively depending on how they were employed and how conscious she was of their effects. The concept of conscious competence became central to her evolving understanding of herself. She began to recognize that her hypervigilance and tactical awareness operated largely at an unconscious level, manifesting in ways that she didn't fully control or direct. By bringing these processes into conscious awareness, she could begin to make deliberate choices about when and how to employ these skills. This shift in perspective had immediate practical implications. In subsequent professional interactions, Sarah became more aware of how her positioning and body language affected others. She learned to modulate her tactical awareness based on the context and the comfort level of those around her. Most importantly, she developed the ability to communicate her intentions and thought processes in ways that reduced rather than increased the anxiety of her colleagues. The transformation wasn't easy or immediate. Years of unconscious habit patterns don't change overnight, and Sarah found herself constantly catching and correcting behaviors that had become automatic. But gradually, she began to experience a sense of agency and control over her professional persona that she had never had before. More significantly, the process of examining and refining her professional identity led to deeper insights about the relationship between personal strength and vulnerability. Sarah began to understand that true strength wasn't about being invulnerable or threatening. It was about being capable of vulnerability when appropriate, while maintaining the ability to be formidable when necessary. "I think I've been confusing strength with defensive positioning," she told Dr. Warren during their ninth session. I've been so focused on protecting myself and being ready for threats that I've forgotten how to be genuinely present with other people. This insight marked a turning point in her development. Instead of viewing her tactical skills and hypervigilance as either assets to be maximized or liabilities to be suppressed, she began to see them as tools that could be employed consciously and selectively based on what the situation required. The process also led to a deeper understanding of what had really happened during the training exercise. The atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that had developed wasn't just a result of the exercise design. It was a reflection of how law enforcement professionals had been trained to view the world. The skills that made them effective at identifying external threats had been turned inward, creating an environment where competence itself became suspicious. Sarah realized that her refusal to participate in the threat identification exercise hadn't just been about protecting her colleagues, it had been an unconscious recognition that the exercise was asking her to weaponize her analytical abilities against people she cared about. Her instinctive rejection of this request suggested a deeper wisdom about the appropriate use of her skills than she had been consciously aware of at the time. This understanding led to a fundamental shift in how she approached her professional development. Instead of focusing primarily on acquiring new skills and capabilities, she began to emphasize the conscious and ethical application of the skills she already possessed. She started thinking of herself not just as a law enforcement professional, but as someone who bore responsibility for how her capabilities affected the people around her. The change was noticeable to her colleagues. Agent Jackson, one of the few people who had supported her during the training exercise rebellion, commented that she seemed more present but less intense in professional settings. Agent Kim observed that she was easier to work with without being less capable. Most tellingly, Agent Martinez, who had initially viewed her refusal to participate in the exercise as suspicious, admitted that he now felt more comfortable working with her because he could better predict and understand her reactions. These changes in professional relationships led Sarah to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly strong in a collaborative environment. She began to see that the highest level of professional competence wasn't about being the most formidable individual in the room. It was about being someone who could enhance the effectiveness of the entire team while maintaining the ability to be decisive and protective when necessary. This realization fundamentally altered her approach to leadership and mentorship. When she was assigned to train new agents, she emphasized not just the development of tactical skills, but the conscious and ethical application of those skills. She taught them to be aware of how their capabilities affected others and to take responsibility for creating environments where collaboration was possible even among highly skilled and potentially dangerous individuals. The transformation also extended beyond her professional life. Sarah began to examine how the defensive and tactical mindset she had developed for her work was affecting her personal relationships. She realized that the same hypervigilance that served her well in dangerous situations was creating barriers to intimacy and genuine connection in her private life. Working with Dr. Warren, she began to develop the ability to consciously adjust her awareness level and defensive posturing based on the context and the people involved. This wasn't about suppressing her natural instincts or pretending to be someone she wasn't. It was about learning to use different aspects of herself appropriately for different situations. "I'm starting to understand that strength isn't about always being ready for battle," she reflected during one of her final sessions with Dr. Benja Warren. "Sometimes strength is about being willing to be vulnerable, to trust others, to let down your guard when it's safe to do so." This insight represented a fundamental evolution in her understanding of what it meant to be a strong person. She began to see that the highest form of strength was the ability to consciously choose one's response to any given situation, rather than being driven by unconscious habit patterns or defensive reactions. Part 3. The Philosophy of Conscious Strength. 6 months after the catastrophic training exercise, Sarah found herself standing before a room full of federal agents at the same facility where everything had begun. But this time, she wasn't a participant, she was the instructor, tasked with developing and implementing a new approach to threat assessment training that addressed the fundamental flaws revealed by her earlier experience. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. The same psychological and analytical capabilities that had marked her as a potential threat to her colleagues had now qualified her to redesign the training program that had created that perception. But the months of intensive self-examination and professional development had given her a unique perspective on how to transform a potentially destructive exercise into a genuinely educational experience. "Today we're going to explore something more complex than simple threat identification," she began, addressing the group of 20 agents who had volunteered for what was being called Advanced Professional Dynamics Training. We're going to examine how competent professionals can work together effectively, even when they possess capabilities that could be dangerous if misused. The approach Sarah had developed represented a fundamental shift from traditional threat assessment training. Instead of teaching agents to identify potential threats among their colleagues, the new program focused on developing conscious competence, the ability to understand and responsibly manage one's own capabilities while creating environments where others could do the same. The first component of the training involved what Sarah termed capability mapping, a process where participants openly discussed their professional skills, psychological tendencies, and potential blind spots with their colleagues. This wasn't about exposing vulnerabilities for exploitation. It was about creating transparency that allowed team members to understand and accommodate each other's operational styles. Agent Rivera, a DEA veteran with extensive undercover experience, explained how his training in psychological manipulation and deception could be unsettling to colleagues who weren't familiar with his background. "I've learned to switch these skills on and off consciously," he shared with the group. "But early in my career, I wasn't always aware when I was using them inappropriately." Agent Thompson, who had been identified as a threat in the original exercise, discussed his combat experience and how hypervigilance developed in war zones could create tension in civilian law enforcement contexts. "The key was learning to recognize when my threat assessment level was appropriate for the situation and when it was overkill," he explained. These discussions revealed a crucial insight that had been missing from traditional training approaches. Competent professionals weren't threats to be managed. They were resources to be understood and effectively integrated. The goal wasn't to suppress or eliminate potentially dangerous capabilities, but to ensure they were employed consciously and appropriately. The second component of Sarah's training program involves scenario-based exercises designed to help agents practice conscious competence in real time. Unlike the original exercise, these scenarios weren't designed to create paranoia or competition. They were structured to help participants understand how their actions and capabilities affected group dynamics and operational effectiveness. One exercise involved a simulated crisis situation where agents had to coordinate response efforts while being conscious of how their individual operational styles might help or hinder the team's effectiveness. Another required participants to identify and address trust issues that emerged during high-stress collaboration, focusing not on who was right or wrong but on how different approaches could be integrated constructively. The most powerful exercise involved what Sarah called conscious transparency, a process where agents practiced openly communicating their thought processes, intentions, and concerns during tactical decision-making. This wasn't about revealing operational secrets or compromising security. It was about creating the kind of clear communication that allowed highly capable individuals to work together without triggering defensive or competitive responses. Agent Kim, who had initially been skeptical of the new training approach, found herself surprised by its effectiveness. "I realized I had been unconsciously testing people, trying to figure out if they were competent enough to trust," she admitted during a debrief session. "Once I started communicating my assessment process openly, it became collaborative instead of adversarial. The results of this approach were remarkable. Teams that had been marked by suspicion and guarded interactions began to develop genuine trust and effective collaboration. More importantly, individual agents began to experience a sense of professional authenticity they had never achieved when forced to suppress or hide their true capabilities." But perhaps the most significant outcome was the development of what Sarah came to understand as conscious strength, the ability to be fully capable while remaining fully present and responsive to the needs of others. This wasn't about being less competent or less formidable. It was about using one's capabilities in service of something larger than personal security or professional advancement. The philosophical implications of this approach extended far beyond law enforcement training. Sarah began to see that the principles of conscious strength applied to any situation where capable individuals needed to work together effectively. The key was developing the awareness and emotional intelligence to use one's abilities in ways that enhanced rather than threatened the group dynamic. This realization led to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly indestructible in a professional context. The agents who had been identified as threats in the original exercise weren't actually dangerous to their colleagues. They were individuals whose unconscious competence created anxiety in others. By making their capabilities conscious and transparent, they became not just non-threatening, but actively supportive of their colleagues' development and success. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," Sarah reflected during a presentation to the training department leadership. But the destruction we're talking about isn't about eliminating weakness through strength. It's about eliminating unconscious defensive patterns that prevent us from using our strength consciously and collaboratively. This insight represented a fundamental evolution in thinking about personal and professional development. Traditional approaches had emphasized either suppressing potentially threatening qualities or maximizing individual capability without regard for interpersonal effects. Sarah's approach suggested a third way, developing the consciousness and emotional intelligence to use one's full capabilities in service of collective effectiveness. The success of the new training program led to requests for similar programs from other federal agencies and eventually from private sector organizations facing comparable challenges. Law firms with highly competitive attorneys, surgical teams with ego-driven specialists, corporate executives with aggressive personalities, all were seeking ways to harness individual excellence without destroying collaborative effectiveness. In each context, the same principles applied. High-performing individuals often developed capabilities that could be threatening to others if used unconsciously or defensively. The solution wasn't to suppress these capabilities, but to develop the awareness and intention to use them constructively. This required not just technical training, but genuine personal development, the kind of inner work that most professional development programs ignored or avoided. Sarah's experience had taught her that true strength wasn't about being invulnerable or intimidating. It was about being capable of conscious response rather than unconscious reaction. The strongest individuals weren't those who could dominate others, but those who could enhance the effectiveness of any group they joined, while maintaining the ability to be decisive and protective when necessary. This understanding led to what she came to see as the central paradox of conscious strength. The more aware and intentional someone became about their capabilities, the less threatening they appeared to others, even as their actual effectiveness increased. Conscious competence was inherently collaborative because it was based on understanding and responding to the needs of the situation rather than defending against perceived threats. The transformation in her own professional relationships provided ongoing evidence for this principle. Colleagues who had once found her intimidating or unpredictable now sought her out for difficult assignments and challenging collaborations. Her reputation evolved from formidable but concerning to exceptionally capable and trustworthy. Not because her skills had diminished, but because her awareness and intentionality had increased. More profoundly, the process had changed her fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a strong person. She no longer saw strength as primarily defensive or competitive. Instead, she understood it as the capacity to remain present and responsive regardless of external circumstances. To use one's capabilities in service of appropriate outcomes rather than personal security, and to maintain authenticity and vulnerability even while being fully prepared to protect oneself and others when necessary. This evolution in understanding had implications that extended beyond professional contexts. In her personal relationships, Sarah found that the same principles applied. The defensive patterns that had served her well in dangerous situations but had created barriers to intimacy could be consciously modulated based on what the relationship needed. She could be fully herself, including the tactical, analytical aspects of her personality, without creating anxiety or distance in people she cared about. The key was developing what she came to think of as contextual authenticity, the ability to express different aspects of one's personality appropriately for different situations without compromising one's essential integrity. This wasn't about being fake or manipulative. It was about being conscious enough to choose which aspects of oneself to emphasize based on what would be most helpful in any given context. Years later, when Sarah was asked to summarize what she had learned from the failed training exercise and its aftermath, she often returned to the same fundamental insight. The goal isn't to eliminate the aspects of ourselves that others might find threatening. The goal is to become conscious enough of these aspects that we can use them skillfully and appropriately. When we achieve that level of consciousness, we become truly indestructible. Not because we're invulnerable, but because we're no longer driven by unconscious fears and defensive patterns. The training program she had developed became a model for similar initiatives across the federal law enforcement community. But more importantly, the principles she had discovered provided a framework for anyone seeking to develop genuine strength and effectiveness in collaborative environments. The path to becoming indestructible wasn't through eliminating weakness or maximizing individual capability. It was through developing the consciousness to use all aspects of oneself in service of appropriate outcomes. In the end, the failed training exercise had revealed something profound about the nature of strength and threat in professional environments. The most dangerous individuals weren't necessarily those with the greatest capabilities. They were those whose capabilities operated unconsciously, creating unpredictability and anxiety in others. The safest and most effective individuals were those who had achieved conscious mastery of their capabilities and could use them transparently and appropriately. Sarah's journey from being identified as a potential threat to becoming a leader in conscious professional development illustrated the transformative power of self-examination and intentional growth. By destroying the unconscious defensive aspects of her professional persona, the weak self that operated from fear and habit rather than consciousness and choice, she had indeed become indestructible in the deepest sense. Not because she was invulnerable to external threats, but because she was no longer limited by internal unconsciousness and defensive reactivity. The woman who had sat in row 3 during that fateful training exercise had been highly capable but unconsciously defensive, formidable but unpredictable, strong but not necessarily trustworthy. The woman who now stood before rooms of federal agents teaching conscious competence had retained all of those capabilities while adding the awareness and intentionality that made her not just effective but truly powerful, in the sense of being able to create positive outcomes in complex, challenging situations. This transformation represented more than professional development. It was a fundamental evolution in consciousness that had implications for anyone seeking to develop genuine strength and effectiveness in a collaborative world. The path was neither simple nor easy, requiring the kind of honest self-examination that most people preferred to avoid. But for those willing to undertake the journey, the rewards extended far beyond professional success, to encompass a way of being in the world that was both authentic and effective, both strong and collaborative, both formidable and fundamentally trustworthy. The training exercise had indeed gone wrong for everyone in row 3 and beyond. But from that failure had emerged a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly strong, truly capable, and truly indestructible, in a world where collaboration and individual excellence needed to coexist. The man, or woman, who destroys the weak self can indeed never be destroyed by others, but the destruction required is not of weakness itself, but of the unconsciousness that prevents strength from being used wisely and appropriately.